Have you ever sat alone in the silence of your own space, only to feel the dissonance between peace and restlessness? Have you ever wondered why some people fear solitude, while others embrace it like an old friend? In a world saturated with digital noise, endless scrolling, and constant connection, the idea of simply being alone feels almost alien. Yet throughout history, some of the wisest minds have sought solitude, not to escape life, but to engage more deeply with it. This work is a meditation on the art of being alone, not as a sentence of loneliness, but as a state of empowerment, transformation, and self-realization. It is a path tread by philosophers, psychologists, mystics, and thinkers. From Nietzsche's courageous isolation to Jung's deep psychological integration, from Kierkegaard's existential truths to Thoreau's communion with nature, the experience of solitude is central to the quest for truth. In these chapters, we will explore solitude, not as a void to fill, but as fertile ground to grow. We will ask difficult questions. Who are we when no one is watching? What emerges when the noise fades and only our thoughts remain? Is it possible that our truest self can only be met in stillness? We begin where most journeys inward begin, with a challenge to the dominant narrative. Is being alone something to fear or to seek? To understand solitude, we must begin with a man who not only walked alone, but who glorified it, Friedrich Nietzsche. The 19th century German philosopher was no stranger to controversy. His writings were sharp, confrontational, and bursting with life. But beneath the bombast was a deep reverence for the individual, for the soul, brave enough to step outside the herd and walk their own path. Nietzsche believed that true greatness could never be achieved in conformity. To live by the values of the masses was, in his view, a betrayal of the self. He often used metaphors of mountains, paths, and heights, emphasizing that the journey toward becoming a higher self required isolation, danger, and deep inner work. The individual has always had to struggle to keep from being overwhelmed by the tribe. If you try it, you will be lonely often, and sometimes frightened. But no price is too high to pay for the privilege of owning yourself. This quote encapsulates Nietzsche's challenge to all who fear solitude. In his mind, isolation was not a punishment, it was a crucible. It separated those who were willing to evolve from those content with mediocrity. Nietzsche's central concept of self-overcoming is born in solitude. When we are alone, stripped of distraction and validation, we are forced to confront our beliefs, fears, and limitations. The silence becomes a mirror, and in that mirror, we see both the them. This is not easy. Nietzsche knew this. He spent much of his own life in solitude, plagued by illness, misunderstood by peers, and yet relentlessly writing. He knew solitude could be agonizing, but he also knew it could be transformative. He who has a why to live for can bear almost any how. In isolation, we discover our why. We stop living for approval. We stop mimicking what society says is right. We start forming values born from our own suffering and our own insight. Nietzsche called this the path to the Übermensch, the overman, the individual who creates his own morality and shapes his own fate. Nietzsche draws a sharp line between loneliness and solitude. Loneliness is a hunger for connection that remains unmet. Solitude, however, is a state of fullness, a relationship with the self that satisfies. In solitude, one doesn't long for company because one is enough. This distinction is crucial. Many avoid being alone because they associate it with pain or rejection. But Nietzsche invites us to rethink that. Maybe what we call loneliness is not about being without others, but about being without ourselves. Nietzsche's call to solitude is not romantic. It is harsh. He knew the price of authenticity is high. The crowd will not understand. The tribe will ridicule. The path will be steep. But for those who choose it, there is reward. The reward of self-possession, freedom, and truth. Become who you are. This challenge, become who you are, can only be undertaken in solitude. Only in silence can we hear the voice of the authentic self. Only in stillness can we discover what we stand for. And only when we are alone can we find out if we are enough for ourselves. In today's world, Nietzsche is more relevant than ever. We are surrounded by conformity, plagued by the fear of missing out, and obsessed with external validation. But Nietzsche's voice cuts through the noise, reminding us that it is in solitude, not in popularity, that we find power. Solitude, he says, is not a punishment. It is preparation. It is the ground where character is forged, where wisdom emerges, where vision is born. In solitude, we don't disappear, we become real. In the quiet lanes of 19th century Copenhagen lived a man whose mind wandered endlessly through the thickets of human existence. Søren Kierkegaard, often called the father of existentialism, was a deeply introspective thinker, preoccupied not with universal systems or grand social orders, but with the individual soul and its tremors, fears, and longings. His was a philosophy of inwardness, raw, personal, spiritual, and it is within this sacred interior space that he revealed the transformative potential of solitude. Kierkegaard didn't just philosophize about being alone, he lived it. Shunning fame and institutional prestige, he remained on the margins of intellectual circles, choosing instead to dwell in thought, prayer, and the written word. But his solitude wasn't mere retreat. It was a deliberate confrontation with the deepest questions of selfhood. To him, the self wasn't something given. It was something to be become through struggle, anguish, and reflection. Kierkegaard's central idea was that truth is subjective. Not that truth is whatever we want it to be, but that real truth is lived, felt, and chosen by the individual. Objective facts may explain the world, but they cannot explain you, your anxiety, your passions, your contradictions. These are not abstract concepts, but living realities. And to grapple with them, you must turn inward. You must be alone. The crowd is untruth. This striking assertion wasn't an indictment of people per se, but of the collective mentality that swallows individuality. For Kierkegaard, the crowd represented conformity, comfort, and denial forces that dulled personal responsibility. In solitude, the individual faces themselves. There is no hiding behind the crowd. There is only the raw, unfiltered question, who am I? To Kierkegaard, solitude is the arena where this question becomes inescapable. The person alone is the person truly confronted. There is no applause, no distraction, no echo, only the voice inside. Kierkegaard's solitude wasn't tranquil like Thoreau's, nor heroic like Nietzsche's. It was often suffused with despair. He didn't shy away from describing the soul's darkness. In fact, he believed it was in this darkness that the self was born. He distinguished between different forms of despair: despair of not being aware of having a self, despair of not wanting to be oneself, and despair of trying to be something one is not. All of these, he argued, were forms of fleeing from the self. And the only antidote was solitude, not just physical solitude, but spiritual solitude, the quiet place in which one dares to face oneself. The greatest hazard of all, losing oneself, can occur very quietly in the world, as if it were nothing at all. Solitude for Kierkegaard is not a luxury. It is a moral and spiritual necessity. Without it, we risk sleepwalking through life, playing roles, pleasing others, but never meeting ourselves. Only in solitude can we drop the act and wrestle with our essence. In his work, Fear and Trembling, Kierkegaard tells the story of Abraham being asked by God to sacrifice his son, Isaac, a story he interprets not as blind obedience, but as the ultimate act of faith. He describes the ideal person, the knight of faith, as someone who walks alone, acts in solitude, and trusts in something beyond reason. This knight doesn't depend on the societal approval or rational validation. He follows an inner command. He listens to a deeper voice. And that path, Kierkegaard insists, is one that cannot be shared. It is solitary, trembling sacred. In this metaphor, we see again Kierkegaard's insistence that the deepest truths are personal and can only be reached in solitude. Faith, authenticity, and identity are not things we inherit. They are chosen, often at great cost, and that choice can only be made alone. What makes Kierkegaard's solitude different from mere isolation is that it's anchored in responsibility. He doesn't suggest fleeing the world in nihilism or withdrawing in bitterness. Instead, solitude is where we take radical ownership of our existence. No excuses, no projections, no blaming the crowd. In solitude, we can no longer say, "They made me do it," or "This is just how life is." In solitude, we are free, and that freedom is terrifying. Because with freedom comes the burden of choice, and with choice comes the need for courage. To dare is to lose one's footing momentarily. Not to dare is to lose oneself. Solitude, then, is not passive. It is active daring and deeply courageous. It demands that we choose our values, forge our path, and answer the existential question, will I become myself? Perhaps one of Kierkegaard's most beautiful paradoxes is this. The more one isolates oneself, the closer one comes to oneself. This is the essence of sacred solitude. Isolation, far from being alienating, can be connecting not to others, but to the deeper self. It is a reconnection with our center, our conscience, our quiet truth. It is not an escape from reality, but an immersion into it stripped of illusions. In solitude, we learn to be honest. Honest about our fears, honest about our dreams, honest about the fact that we do not yet fully know ourselves, but we are willing to try. And in that trying something is born not all at once, but in fragile sacred moments of clarity, a recognition, a reconciliation, a becoming. One of Kierkegaard's most quoted lines is, "Life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards." Solitude gives us the space to look back, to reflect, to learn to gather meaning. But it also strengthens us to go forward not as fragments, but as integrated selves. The past speaks in silence. The future is shaped in stillness. The art of being alone, according to Kierkegaard, is not about escaping life. It's about facing it more fully. It's about peeling away the layers of falsehood until only truth remains. That truth, he assures us, is waiting not out there in the crowd, but in here, in the sacred sanctuary of the self. If Nietzsche thundered through the mountaintops and Kierkegaard searched the trembling soul of the individual, then Henry David Thoreau listened to the gentle murmur of the forest. His solitude was neither rebellious nor tormented. It was reflective, intentional, and rooted in nature. He didn't simply theorize about solitude. He lived it with commitment, conviction, and clarity. Born in 1817 in Concord, Massachusetts, Thoreau was a writer, philosopher, and naturalist. He was a quiet dissenter of modern society's busyness and materialism, choosing instead to seek truth in simplicity and solitude. His most iconic work, Walden, is a living testament to the power of withdrawing from the crowd, not out of contempt, but out of a desire to live deliberately. I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, and not when I came to die, discover that I had not lived. This is Thoreau's challenge to us all. Are we truly living or merely existing? Unlike Nietzsche's internal battleground or Kierkegaard's philosophical storm, Thoreau's solitude was grounded in the tangible world. He built a small cabin by Walden Pond and spent over 2 years in near-complete solitude, writing, thinking, walking, and observing the natural rhythms of life. Nature to him was not just beautiful, it was instructive. I never found a companion that was so companionable as solitude. Thoreau's words exude comfort, not complaint. In solitude, he felt accompanied not by people, but by trees, water wind, and thought. In the absence of distraction, he felt presence. In the stillness of the woods, he heard the stirrings of his own soul. Where many fear being alone, Thoreau found richness. Solitude wasn't an empty room, it was a full forest. It wasn't silence, it was song. And in those moments, he believed we return to the deepest, truest parts of ourselves. Even in the mid-1800s, Thoreau saw the frantic pace of society as a threat to the soul. His time spent at Walden Pond wasn't a retreat from responsibility, it was a refusal to accept an unexamined life dictated by social norms and mindless routine. It is not enough to be busy. So are the ants. The question is, what are we busy about? This is Thoreau's call to mindfulness. Today more than ever, we wear busyness as a badge of honor. We conflate activity with meaning. But Thoreau challenges us to pause, to ask why, to strip away the excess and return to what is essential. Solitude, he argues, is the setting in which we can ask these questions. It is the inner clearing where clutter is removed, where priorities realign, and where the fog of noise gives way to clarity. At the heart of Thoreau's philosophy is one word: deliberateness. To live deliberately means to live on purpose, to be awake to each moment, to each choice. It means rejecting the autopilot life and cultivating intentionality in all we do. Our life is frittered away by detail. Simplify, simplify. Solitude for Thoreau was not just about being alone, it was about awakening. When we step away from the crowd, we see things more clearly. We hear the whisper of our intuition. We realize how often we live, not according to our own rhythm, but to the drumbeat of the world. In solitude, we reclaim that rhythm. We slow down. We breathe. We become aligned with the flow of nature, the seasons, the silence. Thoreau didn't see nature as separate from himself. He believed the external world was a mirror for the inner world. When he watched the pond freeze, he thought about human stillness. When he saw the trees shed leaves, he pondered the beauty of letting go. Heaven is under our feet as well as over our heads. In solitude, nature becomes the perfect teacher, not by giving answers, but by modeling presence. A tree doesn't rush to grow. A stream doesn't force its path. A bird doesn't worry about tomorrow. Thoreau believed that by observing nature in solitude, we could return to our natural state, calm-rooted, open. Solitude taught Thoreau to live in the present. With no appointments, no deadlines, no obligations, he turned his full attention to the now. A single raindrop on a leaf. A ray of sunlight piercing through pines. The echo of a loon across the pond. You must live in the present, launch yourself on every wave. Find your eternity in each moment. This wasn't escapism. It was awareness. It was an antidote to the restless craving for elsewhere. Thoreau's solitude was a practice of returning again and again to the moment, to the breath, to the being. He invites us to ask, what beauty have we missed because we were too distracted to notice? Many have criticized Thoreau, suggesting that his solitude was privileged, even performative. After all, Walden Pond wasn't far from town, and he often received visitors. But such criticisms miss the point. Thoreau wasn't trying to vanish from society, he was trying to see it more clearly by stepping outside it. His solitude wasn't about isolation, it was about observation, reflection, realignment, and in that choice, he showed integrity. Choosing a path few would understand, simply because it felt true. Rather than love, than money, than fame, give me truth. And truth, he believed, could only be found when one was alone with it. Thoreau's time at Walden wasn't meant to be a permanent escape. After just over 2 years, he returned to society. But he returned different. Not because he had found all the answers, but because he had finally learned how to listen for them. The legacy of his solitude is profound. He taught us that the richest life may be the simplest. That in silence we can hear more. That being alone is not an absence, but a presence. and that the truest path may be the one walked slowly, quietly, and intentionally. You may not live near a pond. You may not be able to leave everything behind. But Thoreau's challenge is not literal, it is spiritual. Build your own inner Walden. Carve out spaces in your day where no one else speaks. Let nature speak. Let your breath settle. Let your mind wander, not with worry, but with wonder. Let solitude become your sanctuary, not your sentence. Let it teach you how to live, not fast, not loud, but deliberately. In the darkest corners of human history, Viktor Frankl found light. He did not find it in comfort or freedom, but in the very heart of suffering, within the solitary anguish of a concentration camp. Born in Vienna in 1905, Frankl was an Austrian psychiatrist, neurologist, and Holocaust survivor, but he was also a philosopher of the soul, a man who, despite enduring unimaginable horrors, emerged with a profound and compassionate message. Even in the depths of despair, life holds meaning. Frankl's most famous work, Man's Search for Meaning, is more than a memoir. It is a map one charted not from theory, but from experience. And in that map, solitude appears not as a barren wasteland, but as a fertile space where resilience, dignity, and purpose can bloom. Frankl's solitude was not chosen, it was imposed. Ripped from his family, stripped of his possessions, and imprisoned in Nazi concentration camps, he experienced a form of solitude most of us can hardly imagine, a profound existential aloneness, where even one's humanity was under siege. And yet, even in this crucible of suffering, Frankl found a spark of freedom. He realized that while he could not control his circumstances, he could control his response. That realization was born not in comfort, but in isolation, in the hollow silence of a prison cell, in the aching absence of loved ones, in the solitary inner world of a soul struggling to survive. Everything can be taken from a man, but one thing, the last of the human freedoms to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. Frankl teaches us that solitude, even when forced, can become a sanctuary for inner strength. When the external world becomes unbearable, the internal world becomes vital. At the core of Frankl's philosophy is a radical assertion. Human beings are not primarily driven by pleasure, as Freud believed, or power, as Adler claimed, but by meaning. We crave purpose. We long for significance. And in solitude, when distractions fall away, this longing becomes undeniable. In the concentration camps, many perished not from starvation or illness alone, but from a loss of meaning. Frankl observed that those who could find a purpose, whether the hope of reuniting with a loved one or the desire to finish a manuscript, had a higher chance of surviving. Those who have a why to live can bear with almost any how. Solitude became a space where that why could be remembered, reclaimed, or rediscovered. In his own moments of despair, Frankl would conjure visions of his wife, imagine conversations with her, or mentally rehearse the lectures he would someday give. These mental exercises weren't escapism. They were spiritual resistance. His inner world, untouched by barbed wire, became the ground upon which he stood. One of Frankl's most enduring insights is that between stimulus and response, there is a space, and in that space lies our freedom. Solitude magnifies that space. In stillness, we see our choices. We gain perspective. We awaken the power to decide how we will relate to our circumstances. Even in suffering, Frankl argues, we are not passive victims. We are agents. We can suffer with dignity. We can endure with grace. We can choose not just to survive, but to find meaning in the very act of surviving. When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. Solitude offers us this challenge. It does not remove the pain, but it invites a new relationship with it, one rooted in meaning rather than misery. Frankl identifies 3 ways in which humans can discover meaning: by creating a work or doing a deed. by experiencing something or encountering someone, e.g., love, by the attitude we take toward unavoidable suffering. The third pathway, transforming suffering into meaning, is where solitude plays its most profound role. It is in isolation, stripped of comfort, that we face our suffering head-on. And in that face-to-face confrontation, we are offered a choice: collapse or transcend. Frankl chose transcendence, not by denying his pain, but by giving it purpose. And he invites us to do the same. Hope for Frankl was not wishful thinking. It was a disciplined act of faith, not in a future that is guaranteed, but in the inherent possibility that one can respond meaningfully to any situation. He spoke of the danger of false hope, of expecting freedom by a certain date. When such hope was crushed, many prisoners lost the will to live. But Frankl's hope was different. It was internal, not circumstantial. It did not depend on external change, but on internal resilience. Solitude nurtures this kind of hope. It removes illusions and forces us to look at life as it is. And paradoxically, in that brutal clarity, a deeper kind of hope emerges, one based on truth, strength, and choice. Frankl later developed logotherapy, a therapeutic method centered on helping individuals find meaning in life, especially through adversity. Unlike therapies that focused on the past, logotherapy was forward-looking. It asked not, "What happened to you?" but "What can you do with it?" This question is best answered in solitude, not in distraction, not in denial, but in deep, quiet reflection. Solitude becomes the therapist's office, the pen becomes the tool, and meaning becomes the medicine. Today, most people associate solitude with discomfort. We fill every quiet moment with noise music screens, conversations. But Frankl's story reminds us that in our solitude lies untapped strength. You do not need to be imprisoned to feel isolated. Many people feel existentially alone, even in crowded cities or busy families. But the lesson remains: solitude, though painful, can lead to purpose. What man actually needs is not a tensionless state, but rather the striving and struggling for a worthwhile goal, a freely chosen task. Frankl teaches us to embrace the tension of solitude, to let it stir us, awaken us, call us to more. After his release, Frankl did not return to bitterness. He returned to service. He helped thousands of patients find meaning in their suffering. He wrote, he spoke, he healed. This too is part of solitude's gift. It does not end with the self. What we learn in isolation becomes a gift we can give to others. The meaning we find becomes a light we can share. Frankl did not let his suffering define him. He let it refine him. And in doing so, he became a beacon for millions. Imagine your own solitude as a fortress, not a prison, but a place of quiet strength. Within its walls, you can face your fears, hold your grief, ask your deepest questions. You may find no immediate answers, but you will find something else: the will to keep searching, the courage to endure, the ability to choose your own way. Frankl's life proves that solitude, even when painful, can be a source of profound transformation. Not because it removes suffering, but because it teaches us how to suffer meaningfully. In a world overflowing with noise, few truths strike with as much clarity and discomfort as the words of Blaise Pascal. All of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone. With that single line, Pascal, the 17th century French mathematician, physicist, and philosopher, captured something eternally relevant: that the human mind, when left to its own devices, often chooses distraction over depth, diversion over self-awareness. He did not merely observe this as a social quirk. He saw it as a fundamental problem of existence, one that solitude alone could confront and possibly resolve. Though known for his contributions to science and theology, Pascal's most piercing insights lie in his reflections on human nature, particularly in his unfinished work, Pensées, a collection of fragments that reveal a restless mind obsessed with truth, eternity, and the inner lives of people who refuse to face themselves. This chapter explores solitude not as a serene experience, but as an uncomfortable confrontation, the very kind of encounter Pascal believed was essential to human flourishing. Pascal lived in a time when society was far less connected than it is today, yet he observed a phenomenon that is perhaps more pronounced now than ever before: the fear of stillness, the compulsion to move, to engage, to fill every gap of silence with stimulation. We run heedlessly into the abyss after putting something in front of us to stop us seeing it. This is the human tendency to seek escape from the truths that solitude reveals: truths about mortality, purpose, insignificance, guilt, desire. For Pascal, the avoidance of solitude is not a sign of vitality, but of spiritual and intellectual fear. We fear solitude not because we dislike it, but because we dislike what it shows us about ourselves. Alone, there is no one to blame. No games to play, no masks to wear, just the self-bare, unsettled, unadorned. One of Pascal's most powerful concepts is divertissement or diversion. In his view, people constantly invent distractions to avoid confronting their inner emptiness. Whether it is through entertainment, status, travel, or even religion, used superficially, the soul is constantly being pulled away from its essential questions. Being unable to cure death, wretchedness, and ignorance, men have decided, in order to be happy, not to think about such things. Pascal was not against pleasure or even worldly engagement. His concern was that people use the external world to numb themselves to internal realities. The problem, then, is not that we are busy, it is that we are busy fleeing. And it is in solitude, according to Pascal, that this flight is halted. In the quiet, the diversions die down, the truths surface, and the soul, uncomfortable but awake, begins to ask, "What am I running from?" Pascal believed that being alone with oneself is frightening, because the self is not at peace. Left in silence, we become acutely aware of the unsolved puzzles of our lives. Who am I? What is my place in the cosmos? Why does suffering exist? What will happen when I die? Most people never stop long enough to consider these questions. Or if they do, they quickly reach for the nearest distraction: a scroll, a screen, a drink, a project. But avoidance only deepens the inner void. Pascal challenges us to reverse this pattern. Instead of filling every empty space, he invites us to sit in it, to let solitude do its unsettling work, because it is through this discomfort that something true, even sacred, can be born. Though Pascal was a brilliant mathematician and scientist, he was also a deeply religious man. For him, the ultimate confrontation in solitude was not just with the self, but with God. He believed that when all diversions were stripped away, what remained was a longing for something beyond the self, a longing for eternal truth. There is a God-shaped vacuum in the heart of each man, which cannot be satisfied by any created thing, but only by God the Creator. Pascal's solitude was not just existential, it was spiritual. He saw the quiet chamber not just as a space for thinking, but as a sacred temple, where the soul could meet its maker. And even for the non-religious, his point stands that there is something within us that hungers for the eternal, the meaningful, the infinite, and that this hunger is most acutely felt in solitude. It is there, and perhaps only there, that we sense both our smallness and our infinite worth. One of Pascal's gifts is his willingness to dwell in paradox, that man is both glorious and wretched, noble and broken, capable of truth and prone to folly. Solitude for him is the place where these paradoxes become undeniable. You may find that solitude first brings anxiety. You may feel the weight of your regrets, the ache of your longing, the presence of your fears. But Pascal believed that beneath this initial darkness is a great light, the light of truth, humility, and transformation. Man is but a reed, the most feeble thing in nature, but he is a thinking reed. In solitude, we rediscover the miracle of being able to think, to reflect, to choose. We remember that even if we are vulnerable, we are not powerless. Pascal's hope was that through solitude, we might stop hiding behind diversions and finally face what matters most. If Pascal were alive today, he would likely be both horrified and unsurprised. Our technologies have evolved, but our inner lives have not. We have more ways than ever to avoid being alone, and perhaps fewer chances to know ourselves. Pascal might ask, when was the last time you sat without a screen, without music, without a task, and simply listened to the silence, to your breath, to your soul? He would not scold, he would invite. Into a quiet room, into a hard question, into a sacred stillness where the divine might speak. In a restless world, staying still is an act of rebellion. In a culture of distraction, silence is sacred, and in a society addicted to performance, solitude is a place of honesty. Pascal reminds us that the most important conversations in life happen not in the crowd, but in the chamber, not in noise, but in quiet, not in comfort, but in confrontation. I have discovered that all the unhappiness of men arises from one single fact, that they cannot stay quietly in their own chamber. This is his wisdom, and it is an invitation to sit, to listen, to face what we have been avoiding, and perhaps to be transformed by it. In the depths of the human mind lies a terrain more vast, more mysterious, and more complex than any outer world we could explore. Carl Gustav Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist and psychoanalyst, devoted his life to mapping that inner territory. His work laid the foundation for modern analytical psychology and his ideas archetypes. The collective unconscious individuation remain powerful tools for understanding ourselves, but none of these concepts can be fully grasped without one key element: solitude. For Jung, solitude was not a luxury nor a detour. It was the essential condition for psychological wholeness. Without solitude, we remain fragmented. With it, we begin the long and sometimes painful work of becoming whole. At the core of Jung's psychology is the concept of individuation, the lifelong process of becoming one's true integrated self. Unlike Freud, who emphasized early childhood and repressed desires, Jung believed the human psyche constantly seeks balance between opposites, conscious and unconscious, masculine and feminine, light and shadow. This journey is not automatic. It requires intention, and more importantly, it requires space, mental, emotional, and physical. In a world that constantly demands conformity, distraction, and external validation, Jung believed that the path to individuation could only be walked alone. Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes. In solitude, we look inward. We stop chasing approval. We stop performing. We begin, instead, the sacred task of integration, bringing together the disjointed pieces of our psyche into a harmonious whole. Perhaps Jung's most haunting and transformative idea is that of the shadow, the dark, hidden side of ourselves we deny, repress, or project onto others. The shadow contains everything we're ashamed of, everything society deems unacceptable, and everything we refuse to admit even to ourselves. Knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darknesses of other people. But how do we know our own darkness? Not through busyness, not through endless consumption. Only in solitude, where the masks fall, the noise subsides, and the shadow begins to whisper. Facing the shadow is not easy. It involves shame, fear, and resistance. But Jung believed it was necessary. Without confronting our shadow, we remain shallow. We project our darkness onto others. We split our identity. But in solitude, we create a safe space to invite the shadow in, to dialogue with it, to understand it, and ultimately, to transform it. Jung also taught that our unconscious communicates through dreams and symbols, images that arise not from logic, but from the deep currents of the psyche. These images are rarely accessible in the chaos of daily life. They speak in the language of stillness. They require the silence of solitude to be heard. He often encouraged his patients to record their dreams, reflect on recurring symbols, and spend time alone, not to escape the world, but to listen to the messages hidden within. Your vision will become clear only when you can look into your own heart. Who looks outside dreams? Who looks inside awakes? This awakening does not happen all at once. It is slow, painful, intimate. It happens in the quiet hours of the morning, in walks alone, in silent rooms, in long evenings of contemplation. Solitude becomes the classroom of the soul. Jung believed each of us contains both masculine and feminine energies, what he called the animus and anima. These are not about gender roles, but inner balance. The animus represents logic, will, and action. The anima symbolizes emotion, intuition, and receptivity. A healthy psyche honors both, but to discover these energies, we must go inward. And again, that journey requires solitude. In solitude, the internal dialogues emerge. We begin to notice how we think, how we feel, how we relate to ourselves. We see the imbalance. We notice the overcompensations, and we start slowly to harmonize. Solitude is for me a fount of healing, which makes my life worth living. For Jung, solitude was not isolation, it was integration. In solitude, we gather the lost parts of ourselves, the abandoned inner child, the repressed, creative, the silenced voice. We bring them into the light. We listen. We forgive. We accept. This is not a retreat from life. It is a return to it from a place of greater strength and unity. Jung saw solitude not as a withdrawal from humanity, but as a deepening of humanity. Those who have journeyed inward can offer more outward. They are more compassionate, less reactive, more authentic. Today, Jung's ideas are more needed than ever. We are overstimulated, overconnected, and increasingly estranged from ourselves. We mistake distraction for joy. We confuse identity with branding. We live on the surface. Jung offers a way back, not through mass movements, but through personal solitude. Not by fighting the world, but by integrating the self. To Jung, solitude is the sacred container for psychological rebirth. Without it, we become hollow. With it, we become whole. Solitude in Jung's vision is not always peaceful. Sometimes it is stormy. Sometimes it is terrifying, because to go within is to face what we've hidden. But it is also to reclaim our depth, our mystery, our full humanity. He wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. And that privilege is only granted to those willing to spend time in solitude, not as escape, but as encounter. To encounter the shadow, to encounter the soul, to encounter the self, and to emerge not perfect, but whole." In a time when chaos and complexity seem to define the modern human experience, Jordan Peterson's voice cuts through the noise with a message that is both ancient and urgent. Take responsibility, seek truth, and confront the unknown. But beneath the public debates and viral soundbites, Peterson's philosophy holds a quieter, deeper current one that places solitude at the center of personal development. A Canadian clinical psychologist, professor, and author Peterson has drawn from sources as diverse as mythology, neuroscience, biblical narratives, and Jungian psychology to articulate a guiding principle that meaning in life is found not in ease, but in shouldering responsibility, telling the truth, and facing the dark parts of one's soul. And this internal reckoning, he insists, can only happen in solitude. Peterson often speaks of chaos and order as two fundamental forces. Chaos is the realm of the unknown, the unpredictable, the overwhelming. Order is structure, predictability, responsibility. The individual must walk a line between the two. Too much order leads to rigidity, but too much chaos leads to despair. To walk that line, Peterson says we must confront chaos consciously, and the arena for that confrontation is solitude. The purpose of life is finding the largest burden that you can bear and bearing it. This burden is not external alone. It includes the internal weight of who you are, what you've done, what you've avoided. In solitude, stripped of distractions, these burdens emerge. The fears, the regrets, the lies, the weaknesses, and the seeds of transformation. It's in solitude that the battle is fought and eventually won. Peterson's widely cited phrase, "clean your room," is deceptively simple. It's not just about tidiness, it's a metaphor for taking charge of the smallest part of your world that you can control. But the act also reflects something deeper. Before you change the world, you must order yourself. Solitude allows that process to begin. When you clean your room or organize your thoughts in a journal or meditate on your decisions, you're creating order inside the chaos. You're signaling to your unconscious, I can face the mess. I can take responsibility. I can make something better. If you cannot bring peace to your own household, how dare you try to rule a city? Solitude creates the space where we can restore that inner household, face the disorder within, without external distraction. It gives us the quiet to identify what must change and the courage to begin. Peterson distinguishes between isolation that is harmful, imposed by trauma social rejection, or despair, and voluntary solitude, which he views as necessary for growth. Voluntary solitude is where ideas are born, where the self is examined, where the seeds of creative vision are planted. It is a crucible for resilience, not comfort. If you're not the hero of your own story, then you're missing the whole point. Becoming the hero involves going into the unknown, and often going alone. In myth, the hero always faces the dragon without an army. It is solitude that proves the hero's courage and defines the story. Peterson frequently draws on religious and mythological stories to illustrate psychological truths. The biblical narrative of Christ retreating into the wilderness, or Buddha meditating under the Bodhi tree, mirrors the human need for solitude before enlightenment. Solitude for Peterson is a form of wilderness. It removes the noise, confronts you with your limits, and forces you to think clearly. Reflection becomes an act of responsibility, not just an emotional process, but a moral one. He often advises journaling solitude in nature and reflective reading as means to deepen self-knowledge. Because when we reflect, we become aware of our lies, our avoidances, our hypocrisies, and in that awareness, we gain the power to confront them. Peterson acknowledges that solitude is not always pleasant. In fact, one of his key messages is that life is suffering, but meaning can emerge from bearing that suffering well. You must be able to tolerate the terrible vulnerability of being in order to transform it into the highest good. This vulnerability is most visible in solitude. No audience, no feedback loop, just you as you are. And yet, Peterson says if you can tolerate that state and move through it with integrity, you gain something unshakable. You no longer need approval. You no longer depend on the external to determine your value. You become resilient not by removing suffering, but by mastering your relationship to it. A consistent thread in Peterson's work is the insistence on truth-telling to others, but especially to oneself. And solitude is where this begins. Tell the truth, or at least don't lie. In solitude, there is no one to lie to but yourself, and so it becomes a sacred space for honesty. You see your motivations more clearly. You examine your excuses. You recognize your patterns. Peterson argues that integrity is built not in public, but in private battles, choosing truth over self-deception, even when it hurts. Peterson often describes the well-developed individual as someone with an inner fortress, someone who can remain upright in chaos, who can withstand grief, criticism, temptation, and uncertainty. Solitude is how that fortress is built. Just as muscles grow under tension, the mind grows in quiet challenge. You rethink process, you suffer and suffer well, you stare into the abyss and it blinks. Solitude is the space in which you learn to stand alone, not in bitterness, but in purpose. Though often seen as a conservative voice, Peterson's ethic is deeply compassionate. He calls people to bear responsibility, not just for themselves, but for their families, their communities, even the world. But he insists that this cannot be done without first fixing the self. Set your house in perfect order before you criticize the world. This is not a call to isolationism, it is a call to earn your voice. The person who has suffered alone, struggled alone, reflected alone, is more trustworthy, more stable, and more capable of contributing to others. Solitude is not selfish, it is preparation. In a world that constantly encourages expression without reflection, speed without direction, and influence without wisdom, Peterson stands as a rare voice urging the opposite stop. Think, reflect, take solitude seriously. It's not a break from life. It's how you build the foundation for a life worth living. Solitude, in Peterson's model, is where the real transformation begins. Not on the stage, but in the quiet room. Not with the crowd, but with the soul. If you want to stand up straight with your shoulders back, if you want to tell the truth and live with meaning, it begins in solitude. That is where you meet your fear. That is where you confront your chaos. And that is where, slowly, you become something more. We live in an age of infinite connectivity. Social media offers 24/7 access to friends, influencers, and strangers. Notifications blink like synthetic fireflies. Messages fly across the globe in milliseconds. We can share our lives' opinions, meals, and moods at the tap of a screen. And yet beneath this buzzing web of interaction, an epidemic quietly spreads loneliness. Surveys report that more people than ever, especially the young, feel isolated, unseen, and emotionally adrift. How can this be? How did we become so lonely in a world designed to keep us together? The answer lies in a fundamental misunderstanding. Connection is not the same as intimacy. Presence is not the same as awareness. Noise is not the same as meaning. And in this illusion of connection, many have forgotten the power and purpose of real solitude. This chapter explores how the digital age has reshaped our relationship with solitude and why reclaiming it may be the key to psychological survival and even spiritual awakening in the 21st century. Our devices tell us we're never alone. With a phone in hand, we carry the crowd with us into the bedroom, into the shower, into the very act of waking and falling asleep. There is always someone to like, comment, text tag, or scroll through. But this constant exposure, instead of satisfying our hunger for connection, often deepens our loneliness. We are lonely, but not alone. Surrounded, but untouched. Digital connection, when shallow and compulsive, creates a social mirage. It mimics the outward form of community while denying its soul. It replaces the silence needed for depth with endless noise, leaving no room for reflection, slowness, or sincerity. In such a world, solitude is not just rare, it is feared. We avoid it with obsession. Yet it is precisely the absence of real solitude that fuels our alienation. Why are we so afraid of solitude, not just practically, but emotionally? Because the moment we are alone, truly alone, the noise stops. And in that quiet, the unprocessed pain begins to rise. The doubts, the shame, the uncertainty, the existential ache. Rather than feel those things, we run to a video, a feed, a post, a call, anything. In a culture of constant contact, we have lost the ability to sit with our own soul. We've conditioned ourselves to avoid discomfort by outsourcing our attention. But in doing so, we've also numbed our joy, our creativity, and our sense of self. Solitude used to be a sacred space, a garden for the inner life. Now it is treated like a wasteland to be fled. Social platforms promise self-expression, but often deliver self-distortion. They encourage us to craft versions of ourselves that will gain approval, likes, and followers. Over time, this curated identity can become more real to us than our true self. The tragedy: we lose touch with who we are when no one is watching. Solitude offers a remedy. In solitude, there are no followers, no metrics, no masks, just the unfiltered self, raw, vulnerable, and real. Without moments of solitude, we risk living our entire lives in performance mode, never pausing to ask, is this who I really am? Modern society often confuses loneliness with solitude, yet they are profoundly different experiences. Loneliness is the pain of being disconnected from others. Solitude is the peace of being connected to oneself. In solitude, we are not deprived, we are restored. We are not abandoned, we are anchored. It is in solitude that we learn to self-soothe, to reflect, to process, to rest. Without it, we depend entirely on others for regulation, validation, and identity. Another reason solitude is rare in the digital age is because our attention is no longer ours. Every platform, app, and notification is designed to steal it, to hijack our inner stillness and repurpose it for profit. We are not simply distracted, we are being strategically disoriented. This external bombardment fractures our attention span, weakens our inner compass, and leaves us too scattered to engage deeply with ourselves. Solitude becomes an act of resistance, to disconnect, to unplug, to reclaim your attention as your own. In an age of constant noise, silence is revolutionary. To turn off your phone, to sit in stillness, to take a walk without headphones, to journal without sharing. These simple acts are now countercultural and healing. They invite the return of something profound inner voice. You may hear discomfort at first, but soon clarity returns, creativity stirs, old wounds speak, new ideas emerge, and something ancient awakens the you that has been drowned beneath the noise. Thought leaders like Cal Newport advocate for digital minimalism, the intentional practice of using technology as a tool, not as a tether. This means creating sacred spaces of disconnection, tech-free mornings or evenings, solitude walks in nature, reading instead of scrolling, journaling without posting. The goal isn't to abandon technology, but to balance it to ensure that time spent online is aligned with values, not impulses. In doing so, we rediscover that solitude isn't empty time, it's soul time. The deepest tragedy of hyperconnection is the death of the inner life. When every thought is shared, every feeling commented, on every moment filtered, we begin to live from the outside in. But solitude reverses the flow. It invites us to live from the inside out, to ask, what do I believe, not what is trending? What do I feel, not what is rewarded? What do I value, not what is viral? These are questions that cannot be answered in a comment section. They can only be heard in silence and answered in solitude. Ironically, solitude may be the only path back to real connection. Why? Because people who are grounded in themselves, who have sat with their shadows, listened to their pain, found peace in their own company, are capable of deeper intimacy with others. They don't use others to escape themselves. They bring presence, depth, honesty, compassion. Solitude doesn't isolate us. It prepares us. It cultivates the clarity and resilience required for meaningful relationships in a noisy world. The digital age has given us many gifts, but it has also taken something precious: the quiet, the stillness, the unmediated self. If we are to reclaim it, we must make solitude not a punishment, but a practice. It doesn't take much. 10 minutes of silence a day, a long walk without a phone, a weekend offline, a single hour without interruption. In these moments, we meet ourselves again, and we begin to heal. The irony is this: only by learning to be alone can we truly show up for others. In the end, we are not alone in our loneliness, and by embracing solitude, we may find our way back to ourselves and back to each other. If the West has often framed solitude as a battleground, a place to wrestle with darkness, truth and the self, the East has long regarded it as a flowing stream, a space of alignment rather than resistance. Within Taoism, Zen Buddhism, and other Eastern traditions, solitude is not something to overcome, but something to enter. It is not isolation from life, but an immersion into the deeper rhythms of existence. These philosophies invite us to stop striving, to stop analyzing, to stop becoming, and instead to start being. And it is in solitude that we most clearly encounter this shift from doing to being, from force to flow, from mind to presence. The Tao Te Ching, attributed to the sage Lao Tzu, is one of the most quietly profound texts ever written. It speaks not with declarations, but with paradoxes. It doesn't prescribe, it invites. It suggests that truth is not something you conquer, but something you allow. The Tao is like a well-used but never used up. It is like the eternal void filled with infinite possibilities. Taoism teaches Wu Wei, the art of non-action or effortless action. This does not mean doing nothing, but rather acting in harmony with the natural flow of the universe. It means letting go of struggle, of force, of excessive striving. And where can this be most deeply realized? In solitude. When the noise of others subsides, when the pull of ego relaxes, we begin to feel the current beneath things. We sense the flow, we stop pushing, we float. Taoist sages often retreated into mountains not to escape, but to listen to birdsong, to wind, to the Tao itself. They discovered that solitude is not absence, it is presence. Not emptiness, but emptiness full of possibility. Zen Buddhism, which evolved in China and flourished in Japan, offers another deeply reverent vision of solitude. In Zen, silence is a language. Stillness is a practice. Attention is the path. Zen does not seek to fill the mind with thoughts. It seeks to quiet it, not by suppression, but by attention. Zen monks often spend hours, even days, in zazen, seated meditation facing a blank wall. There is no stimulation, no sermon, no distraction. There is only breath, posture, stillness, and the moment. This radical simplicity reveals something: that beneath our frantic thoughts lies a vast open sky, that beyond the chatter is clarity, that solitude is not lonely when one is fully present. When you sit, just sit. When you walk, just walk. Above all, don't wobble. Zen solitude trains us to do one thing: be here. No memory, no anticipation, no identity, just this. And in that great peace, both Taoism and Zen embrace the paradox that true fullness comes from emptiness. That solitude, when entered with openness, is not a void to fear, but a space to discover the real. Western minds often resist this. We want to fill, fix, solve. But the East says, sit, breathe, let it be. Silence is a source of great strength. Lao Tzu. This silence is not inert. It is alive. It is the silence in which bamboo grows, in which mountains rest, in which hearts return to peace. And in this solitude becomes not something we endure, but something we return to like a home. The teachings of the East feel especially urgent today. In a world of speed, they offer stillness. In a culture of performance, they offer presence. In a society of surfaces, they offer depth. They remind us that solitude is not the problem, our relationship to it is. If we approach it with fear, we find despair. If we approach it with openness, we find clarity. Eastern wisdom doesn't glorify solitude as suffering. It regards it as medicine, not a punishment, but a purification. A gentle, sacred pause in which the soul resets. Across these 9 chapters, we've walked with philosophers, poets, psychologists, and sages. We've seen solitude framed as a mirror, a mountain, a pond, a battlefield, a sanctuary, a classroom, a chapel, and a quiet trail through bamboo. Each voice brought a different angle, yet they all shared one truth. Solitude is not where we lose ourselves. It is where we meet ourselves. Nietzsche called it the path to greatness. Kierkegaard saw it as the crucible of faith. Thoreau built it with wood and lived it. Frankl found it in horror and emerged with meaning. Pascal demanded we face it to know truth. Jung entered it to heal. Peterson framed it as the foundation for character. And the East embraced it as the river beneath the world. They disagreed on many things, but not on this solitude. When practiced with intention is not dangerous. It is transformative. So what now, in a world that never stops talking, dare to be silent? In a culture that rewards constant display, dare to be unseen? In a time obsessed with validation, dare to sit with yourself unjudged, unnamed. There will be discomfort. There will be boredom. There may even be fear. But then there will be breath, peace, creativity, truth, clarity, healing. Solitude is not a luxury for monks and mystics. It is a birthright, a need, a calling. And you don't need a cabin in the woods or a cave in the mountains. You need only to close your eyes, breathe deeply, and listen. You need only to stop just for a moment and be. You will find that you are not empty. You are vast. You are not broken. You are unfolding. You are not alone. You are home.